You know, usually when we look back at human history, we tend to picture this very clean, linear progression.
Right, like climbing a ladder.
Exactly, like a ladder. You start with these wandering bands of hunters. They figure out how to plant wheat. They decide to settle down, build some houses, and then boom, they invent religion and start building these massive temples.
It is comforting. I mean, it makes logical sense. It's the classic cause and effect model we've relied on for over a century now.
Yeah, agriculture creates a surplus of calories, right?
Right. And that surplus frees up time because not everyone has to forage all day. And that newly discovered free time leads to art, complex religion, and monumental architecture.
But then you step into the hills of southeastern Turkey and suddenly that entire ladder it completely collapses.
It really does.
We are looking at an archaeological landscape today that completely flips the script. What if the urge to gather, to worship, to build monuments together didn't come after we settled down?
What if that spiritual yearning actually came first?
Yeah, and farming was just a byproduct of needing to feed the builders. So we are going to drift back thousands and thousands of years into deep history today for this deep dive.
We're looking at the exact moments and places where humanity transitioned from wandering the earth to stacking stone upon stone.
Building the blueprint of the world you know today.
And to really understand this transition, we have to slow down. We're synthesizing data spanning over 11 millennia, looking closely at how humans interacted with shifting ecological realities.
So find a comfortable spot, take a breath, and let's just drift back to 9600 BCE.
A very, very long time ago.
I mean, just picture a windswept, rocky mountaintop in Upper Mesopotamia. This is in modern-day Turkey.
This is Göbekli Tepe.
It's 11,000 years old. That is, well, it's thousands of years before Stonehenge.
Thousands of years before the Egyptian pyramids, too.
Right, and what is sitting on this barren hill is just mesmerizing.
To put the scale into a physical perspective for you, the site covers about 20 acres, and it consists of these massive circular enclosures.
And inside these enclosures are these colossal T-shaped limestone pillars.
We're talking about monoliths standing over 16 feet tall.
16 feet?
Yeah, and weighing up to 20 tons each.
Mm-hmm.
And they aren't just rough-hewn rocks dragged out of the dirt either. They're intricately carved in high relief.
Wait, hold on. I'm trying to picture the sheer mechanics of this. We are talking about 9600 BCE, right?
That's right.
These are nomadic hunter-gatherers. They don't have bronze chisels. They don't have iron saws. They don't have, like, wheels or pulleys.
No, none of that.
How do you carve a 20-ton limestone block out of solid bedrock, move it, and stand it up vertically?
It requires a staggering amount of human brute force and friction. They use primitive flint tools.
Just like...
Yeah, flint is a hard sedimentary rock that fractures with incredibly sharp edges when you strike it. So you have hundreds of people using heavy stone hammers to literally pound and chip away at the softer limestone bedrock.
Just slowly chipping away until a pillar is isolated.
Exactly. And then, using levers made of thick timber and wooden sledges greased with animal fat, they would just inch these 20-ton stones up the hillside.
I mean, the calories required for that kind of labor must have been astronomical.
Beyond what a normal foraging group would ever need.
But what really gets me are the carvings on these pillars. If I'm a starving hunter-gatherer living day to day, I'd expect drawings of, I don't know, deer or gazelle.
The things keeping you alive, right?
Yeah. I'm painting the hunt so the hunt is successful, but instead they carve these formidable, terrifying creatures.
Lions, scorpions, vultures, spiders, and snakes just crawling up the sides of the pillars.
Some pillars even have stylized human arms and hands carved into them wearing belts. It's like the stones themselves are anthropomorphic.
Like giant, faceless ancestors watching over the enclosure.
The iconography is genuinely puzzling because, as you noted, it completely ignores the game they actually hunted and ate.
And we know what they ate from the animal bones found at the site. Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist who first recognized the significance of this site in 1994, theorized that this wasn't about daily survival at all.
It was something else entirely.
Right, it was a deeply complex symbolic system. The focus on apex predators and venomous creatures suggests a shamanic practice, or perhaps a cosmogonic map.
A way of relating the community to the terrifying, uncontrollable forces of the cosmos.
Exactly. Schmidt argued this was a regional ceremonial center. Small nomadic bands from all across the region would periodically converge on this hilltop for massive building projects and ritual feasts.
And then they would just scatter back into the wilderness.
Yep, back to their nomadic lives.
Which brings us back to the calories. If you have hundreds of nomads converging on a dry mountaintop to drag stones, how are they not starving to death?
You can't just forage enough wild berries to feed a construction crew of that size.
You really can't. That is the crux of the paradigm shift we were talking about. How do you sustain the sheer caloric output required for this labor?
The archaeological evidence suggests they had to figure out a reliable food source.
They didn't have a choice.
Right, the necessity of feeding this massive, coordinated labor force directly led to the intense cultivation and eventual domestication of wild einkorn wheat and barley.
So in this model, religion and ritual catalyzed the Neolithic Revolution.
The spiritual need to gather came first.
And the farming was just a desperate, brilliant adaptation to sustain the gathering.
It's a complete reversal of how we used to think about it.
It's like a group of wandering people deciding to build a massive, ornate cathedral before anyone had even invented the concept of a town or a permanent house.
It's purely driven by vision and belief.
But if they are up on a dry, rocky ridge working under the blazing sun, they need massive amounts of water. Where is that coming from?
The engineering of their water supply is almost as impressive as the pillars, honestly.
Really?
Yeah, investigations revealed a highly sophisticated rainwater harvesting system. They use those same flint tools to carve deep channels directly into the bedrock. These channels caught the seasonal rains and fed them into subterranean cisterns.
And how big were these cisterns?
They could hold roughly 5,300 cubic feet of water.
That is massive.
It's basically an artificial oasis built into the rock, allowing this massive population to survive the dry seasons.
So does that mean they eventually just stayed there? I mean, if they have water and they are growing wheat to feed the builders, do they stop scattering back into the wilderness?
That's where the archaeological narrative is currently experiencing some friction. Schmidt firmly believed it was strictly a cultic sanctuary with no permanent inhabitants.
Because there weren't any houses.
Right. He pointed to the lack of domestic hearths and daily trash pits. But, more recent excavations are challenging that absolute view.
What are they finding now?
Well, in 2025, a team led by Arkadiusz Marciniak discovered what they call the House of the Dead, or the Spiritual House.
Oh, wow.
They found the remains of 20 individuals interred beneath a plaster floor, alongside a ceremonial structure supported by platforms.
So they were burying their dead right there.
Yes. Furthermore, they're starting to find emerging signs of extensive cereal processing and smaller domestic structures nearby.
So it's blurring the lines. It's not just a pilgrimage site anymore.
It's a place where ritual and daily survival are beginning to deeply entangle.
But a mountaintop rainwater cistern is a fragile lifeline. I mean, to really build a permanent society, you can't just rely on catching rain on a ridge.
No, eventually that won't be enough.
You need a permanent gushing water source, which forces humanity to look downward, down into the valleys.
Yes. To see that next crucial step, we have to travel south from the rocky ridges of Turkey, down into the lush, deep depression of the Jordan Valley.
We arrive at Tel Esultan, better known as ancient Jericho.
This is dating back to around 10,000 BCE.
But to understand why people settled at Jericho, we really have to explain the climate they were running from, because the world was changing.
The environment was incredibly hostile. This was the end of a period geologists call the Younger Dryas.
Imagine a sudden 1,000-year global deep freeze.
Glacial meltwater in North America flooded into the Atlantic, disrupting the warm ocean currents. The plant's temperature just plummeted.
In the Middle East, this translated to severe, biting cold and intense drought.
Permanent habitation in most places was nearly impossible.
You were constantly moving just to find a patch of green or a herd of animals to hunt.
But Jericho was an anomaly. It possessed the Ain Sultan Spring,
a perennial, bubbling source of fresh water that never froze and never dried up.
During the worst of the Younger Dryas, a group of people known as the Natufian hunter-gatherers would camp around this spring.
They were foragers, right?
Yes, and we know they were there because they left behind thousands of crescent-shaped microlith tools.
These are tiny, incredibly precise stone blades they use for cutting wild grasses.
So they're camping at this spring, just waiting out the Ice Age.
And then, around 9600 BCE, the Younger Dryas ends. The world warms up.
The glaciers retreat, the rains return, and the Jordan Valley explodes into a lush oasis.
And these Natufians look around and think, well, why leave?
They extended their stays. Seasonal camping slowly transitioned into year-round habitation.
This brings us into a distinct archaeological era called the Pre-Pottery Neolithic A period, or PPNA.
By 9500 to 9000 BCE, they are building permanent domestic architecture.
Small circular dwellings, maybe 16 feet across, built from sun-dried clay and straw bricks.
But the most staggering feature of Jericho isn't the circular houses.
No, not at all. Around 8000 BCE, this village of people who, let's remember, still don't have pottery or metal, constructed a monumental stone wall.
Over 11 feet high and nearly 6 feet wide at the base.
And inside this wall stood the Tower of Jericho. This is a conical stone structure towering 28 feet high.
And inside this solid stone mass is an internal, core-built staircase with 22 stone steps.
I mean, the construction technique alone is fascinating. A core-belt roof or staircase isn't a true arch.
No, it's different. Instead, builders stack layers of flat stones, with each new layer jetting slightly further inward than the one beneath it, until they eventually meet in the middle.
It requires immense weight on the outer edges to keep the jutting stones from tipping inward and collapsing.
Exactly. To execute that internally, inside a 28-foot solid stone tower demonstrates a profound leap in engineering.
But why? I mean, why go through the immense, back-breaking, hand-shredding effort to build a 28-foot stone tower and a massive wall around your village?
That question has fueled one of the longest-running debates in Middle Eastern archaeology.
Kathleen Kenyon had a pretty famous theory about it.
She did. She excavated the site in the 1950s, and she theorized it was purely military, a defensive fortification.
In her view, Jericho was the first urban community, and because they had a reliable spring and agricultural surplus, they were a target.
The wall was to protect their wealth from nomadic raiders.
Which, sounds logical on the surface. You have food, the nomads don't, you build a wall.
But there's a flaw there.
Yeah, who exactly is organizing an army of nomads in 8000 BCE capable of breaching an 11-foot stone wall? It seems like overkill.
Later archaeologists, like Ofer Bar Yosef, challenged Kenyon's military theory for that exact reason.
He looked at the topography instead, didn't he?
He did, and pointed out that the wall might have been environmental. Jericho sits near western wadis.
Those are the dry river beds that channel catastrophic flash floods during heavy winter rains.
Right. Bar Yosef argued the wall was a barrier to manage these devastating alluvial mudslides, protecting their homes and precious agricultural soil from being washed away.
Okay, a flood wall makes perfect sense. But a flood wall doesn't explain a 28-foot tower with an internal staircase.
It really doesn't. You don't need a massive watchtower to stop a mudslide.
You certainly don't. And that is where researchers Ran Barkai and Roy Loran introduced a radically different astronomical theory.
They used computer modeling to reconstruct the ancient skies and topography.
And they discovered something amazing about the summer solstice, right?
Yes. On the summer solstice, the longest day of the year, the nearby Mount Corantal cast a distinct shadow.
As the sun set, this shadow fell precisely over the Tower of Jericho and then spread out to engulf the entire village.
A shadow moving over the town on the summer solstice. Barkai argues that this tower was essentially a machine designed to create awe.
To create awe, and more importantly, to create social cohesion.
We have to remember that the transition to a settled agricultural lifestyle was psychologically and physically brutal.
Farming is far more labor-intensive and repetitive than foraging.
It requires rising at dawn, breaking your back in the mud, and surrendering your autonomy to a communal schedule.
Barkai suggests the tower, with its theatrical, precise interaction with the cosmos, was a mechanism to enforce the harsh new realities of this lifestyle.
It's almost like the ultimate ancient PR campaign for agriculture.
Exactly. The leaders or priests are basically saying, look at the power we possess. Look at how this structure commands the sun and the shadows. You are part of something cosmic. Now, get back into the fields and keep working.
It demonstrates that monumental architecture wasn't just functional. It was deeply psychological. It bound the community together through shared awe and intimidation.
And we see the psychological binding become even more intimate as we move into the next phase, the pre-pottery Neolithic B period, starting around 720 BCE.
The houses change here.
They stop building circles and start building rectangles, right?
The architecture becomes rectilinear, yes. They're using loaf-shaped mud bricks with deep thumbprints pressed into them so the mortar grips better.
But it's what they are doing inside these houses that is truly profound.
You were talking about the dead.
Because the way they treated their ancestors becomes incredibly intimate. They buried them under the floors of the houses, which they were already doing.
But now they are retrieving the human skulls of their ancestors, bringing them up into the living room, and meticulously reconstructing their facial features using plaster.
And they set actual seashells into the eye sockets to make them look alive.
These plastered skulls are considered by some art historians to be the earliest examples of portraiture.
Wow. But functionally, it points to a profound ancestor cult. By preserving the faces of the dead and keeping them visibly present within the domestic space, they were creating a physical continuity between generations.
I always think of it as the ultimate physical version of a family photo album, but with much higher stakes.
High stakes in what way?
Well, if you are foraging, the land belongs to whoever is standing on it. But if you are farming, you need to prove that this specific plot of fertile soil belongs to your family.
That makes sense.
What better way to prove your lineage than to literally live with the physical faces of your ancestors staring out from the walls of your living room? It anchors your claim to the land.
It firmly establishes a sense of place, lineage, and property rights. But while Jericho and Göbekli Tepe are monumental milestones, they are still just early steps.
A walled village with a water spring is not a civilization.
No. To truly cross the threshold into what we define as a complex urban society, a massive systemic shift had to occur. Right. We use the word civilization casually today, sometimes just to mean, people living close together with some cool buildings.
But it's much more mechanistic than that.
To understand the engine of a true city, we have to look at the blueprint laid out by the Australian archaeologist V. Gordon Childe in his 1936 book, Man Makes Himself.
Gordon Childe fundamentally changed archaeology because he stopped looking at artifacts purely as isolated museum pieces and started applying social science.
He wanted to know how a kin-based, illiterate village actually transforms into a complex urban state.
He proposed a theoretical framework called the Urban Revolution, outlining 10 critical transformations.
Rather than just listing these out, let's look at how they logically cascade into one another. Because Childe's points really act as the schematic for the modern world you and I live in today.
It starts with sheer numbers.
A village has a few hundred people. But when you cross into a city, you hit Childe's first trait, demographic concentration. We are suddenly talking about tens of thousands of people living shoulder to shoulder.
And that sheer density triggers a chain reaction. If you have 50,000 people crammed into a city center, they cannot all be farmers.
There just isn't enough land within walking distance.
This forces the second transformation, labor specialization. You suddenly have artisans, merchants, tool makers, and priests who never touch a plow in their entire lives.
But wait, if they aren't farming, how are they eating? The guy making pottery all day still needs 2,000 calories.
This relies entirely on the third mechanism, surplus extraction. The farmers working the periphery of the city are forced to produce vastly more food than their own families need.
This extra grain is collected as a tithe or a tax by a central authority.
Storable food surplus, specifically grain, which doesn't rot quickly, becomes the ultimate social capital. It is the fuel that powers the entire urban engine.
And the central authority collecting all that grain wants to show off its power and securely store that wealth, which leads to monumental architecture.
Not just a 28-foot tower, but massive temples, palaces, and granaries that symbolize collective power and physically protect the food supply.
Naturally, the officials, the military leaders, and the priests who manage this massive surplus aren't living in the same conditions as the farmers.
They absorb a major share of the wealth, shattering the old egalitarianism of the village and creating social stratification.
Society fractures into distinct socioeconomic classes. A ruling elite, a managerial priesthood, a merchant class, commoners, and often enslaved populations.
But here is the logistical nightmare. If you are taxing 50,000 people, taking a percentage of their grain, paying artisans in beer and bread, and managing trade routes, you cannot do that in your head.
Human memory completely fails at that scale.
Which forces the invention of writing and information recording.
Writing didn't emerge to write poetry, it emerged as a desperate administrative tool for accounting.
You need ledgers to track who paid their taxes and who owes what. And alongside writing, you need predictive sciences, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy.
You need math to measure the exact acreage of fields, to calculate the volume of green silos, and to predict the flooding season so the crops don't wash away.
And once you have this wealthy, concentrated elite, they want to project their ideology. So you see standardized artistic expression, pan-regional styles of art that visually reinforce the power of the ruling class.
They also want luxury goods to separate themselves from the commoners, which drives long-distance trade.
They are sending merchants hundreds of miles to import exotic raw materials like lapis lazuli, obsidian, and timber.
Which culminates in the final, perhaps most profound psychological shift, a state organization based on residence rather than bloodlines.
In a village, your loyalty is to your extended family, your clan.
But in Childe's urban state, your primary identity shifts. You belong to the city. You are a citizen of a geographic state backed by a centralized government that holds a monopoly on coercive violence.
It's a complete rewiring of human society.
I used to picture this shift from village to city as just a village getting bigger, like a biological organism, an amoeba just growing larger. But Childe shows us it's not biological growth, it's the construction of a complex machine.
An engine.
Yeah, the farmers are the pistons generating the raw energy, the surplus grain is the fuel, the priests and kings are the governors directing the power, writing is the oil keeping the gears from grinding to a halt, and the merchants are the transmission moving that energy outward.
Every single part relies completely on the others.
If the farmers stop producing, the artisan starves. If the artisan stops making bronze plows, the farmer can't harvest enough to pay the tax. The entire machine seizes up.
It's incredibly precarious, despite its power.
But, I have to push back a little on Childe. Like, does a society really have to have all 10 parts of this engine to be considered a civilization?
What do you mean?
Well, what about the Incas? They had massive monumental architecture, profound social stratification, and incredible predictive sciences. But they lacked a formal written script, relying instead on corpus, those complex knotted strings for accounting. Does lacking a written alphabet mean they are just a proto-civilization?
That is a fantastic point of friction, and modern archaeology has heavily critiqued Childe's model for being too rigid or too Eurocentric in its definitions of things like writing.
Right.
The Incas are unequivocally recognized as a pristine civilization. Quipus served the exact administrative function of writing, even if they weren't phonetic texts.
So it's not a rigid binary checklist where checking the 10th box magically unlocks the civilization achievement.
No, but Childe's criteria brilliantly described the specific mechanics of the region he was studying, the land between the rivers.
Exactly. If we take Childe's blueprint of this urban engine and bring it to the Middle East, we find a harsh, sun-baked plain that built this machine with aggressive, terrifying precision.
We're entering Mesopotamia, specifically the southern region known as Sumer, encompassing modern-day Iraq and Kuwait.
The word Mesopotamia translates from ancient Greek to between rivers the Tigris and the Euphrates.
To understand why civilization exploded here, we have to look at the paradoxical nature of the environment.
On one hand, the soil is incredibly fertile, consisting of millennia of nutrient-dense alluvial silt deposited by the slow movement of the rivers.
On the other hand, the climate is a hyper-arid desert. It is blazingly hot, and farming is utterly impossible through rainfall alone.
It's a landscape that actively wants to kill you, but offers unlimited wealth if you can tame it.
Before the Sumerians dominated this landscape, a prehistoric people known as the Ubaidians arrived around 6500 BCE.
They were the true pioneers of the alluvial plains.
They looked at the massive, inhospitable, reed-choked marshlands near the Persian Gulf and figured out how to drain them.
They carved the very first irrigation ditches, established weaving and leatherwork, and built the foundational towns.
They laid the groundwork for the Sumerians, who called their land Kandir, the country of the noble lords.
And this civilization hits terrifying speeds during the Uruk period, from roughly 4000 to 3100 BCE.
The city of Uruk becomes a monster. It becomes the most urbanized city on the planet, surpassing 50,000 inhabitants.
The demographic concentration is staggering.
And we should clarify that Sumer wasn't a single unified empire like Egypt later became.
Right. It was a collection of fiercely independent, highly competitive city-states. Cities like Uruk, Bad Tabira, and Eridu.
Eridu is particularly fascinating. In Sumerian mythology, it was the first city ever created.
It was believed to be the home of Enki, the god of fresh water, wisdom, and magic.
Who ruled from his temple called Iebzu, meaning the house of the aquifer.
Because they had to manage these massive populations in a hyper-arid desert, they became engines of technological invention.
To handle the accounting of feeding 50,000 people, they invented cuneiform script.
They would take a reed stylus and press wedge shapes into wet clay tablets. Initially, it was just spreadsheets, recording deaths, barley yields, and sheep inventories.
But eventually that accounting tool evolved into literature, giving us the Epic of Gilgamesh.
They were relentlessly innovative. They gave us the potter's wheel, which was later flipped sideways to create wheeled chariots and carts.
They developed sophisticated bronze metallurgy, blending copper and tin to create vastly superior tools and weapons.
They mapped the night sky, developing a lunisolar calendar.
And incredibly, they invented the sexagesimal math system.
A numeral system based on the number 60, which is wild to think about because we still use it every single day.
We really do.
When you look at a clock and count 60 seconds in a minute or 60 minutes in an hour, or when you measure 360 degrees in a circle, you aren't using a modern metric system.
You are literally thinking like a Sumerian priest from 5,000 years ago.
It's a profound legacy of continuity.
But to truly visualize the power dynamics of a Sumerian city-state, you have to picture the center of their world, the ziggurat.
The government in Sumer was a theocracy.
The city was organized around a massive, stepped mud brick platform that supported the temple of the city's patron god.
And these weren't just big hills. The great ziggurat of dedicated to the moon god Nana, was a colossal structure.
It is estimated that they used 720,000 baked bricks to build just the outer shell.
It towered 100 feet over the completely flat alluvial plains. It was a man-made mountain.
It was.
But I want to pause on the logistics of that. 720,000 baked bricks. They live in a hyper-arid desert. There are no massive forests.
No, trees are scarce.
To bake a clay brick in a kiln so it becomes waterproof, you need a tremendous amount of fuel to maintain a fire at nearly 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit for days. How on earth did they bake 720,000 bricks without trees?
That highlights the sheer scale of their supply chain and their environmental impact. To fuel those kilns, they had to harvest millions of bundles of dry marsh reeds.
Millions.
Yes, burn immense quantities of dried animal dung, and utilize their long-distance trade networks to import timber from places like the Zagros Mountains or the Cedars of Lebanon.
The environmental cost of building just one ziggurat was staggering, which is why the inner cores were usually sun-dried bricks, with only the outer layer being kiln-baked for weatherproofing.
And the ziggurat wasn't just a church for quiet prayer. It was the absolute nerve center of the city.
It was the administrative hub, the industrial center for weaving and metallurgy, the emergency shelter when the rivers flooded, and crucially, the central bank where all the grain was stored and redistributed.
Atop these structures ruled the governing priest and later the Lugal, which literally translates to big man or king.
They claimed direct divine guidance.
But here's my question about the power dynamics. I look at their irrigation system like a nuclear reactor.
It generates immense civilization-building power in the form of surplus grain, but it is incredibly volatile.
The Tigris and Euphrates are infamous for sudden, violent spring floods that can wash away a town, or severe droughts that turn the soil to dust.
The canals and water gates are the control rods. If you don't carefully manage the water, the reactor melts down, the soil gets too salty, crops fail, and everyone starves.
Doesn't that absolute reliance on a centralized irrigation network completely trap the everyday farmer?
If the Lugal controls the ziggurat, and the ziggurat controls the grain, and the city administration controls the water gates, whoever controls the water controls the people.
You can't just pack up and walk away into the desert if you don't like the king's taxes. You will die.
That is the defining characteristic of what historians call a hydraulic empire. The extreme hyper-cooperation required to dig, dredge, and maintain miles of intricate canals necessitates a massive centralized authority.
And that authority holding the literal keys to survival, invariably wields immense coercive power over the population. You are inextricably trapped by the very infrastructure that keeps you alive.
And because the fertile land between the rivers was so narrow, and because controlling the upstream water flow was a matter of life and death, Sumer was a pressure cooker.
It was defined by almost constant grinding warfare among the city-states for over 2,000 years.
They were constantly fighting over boundaries and water rights. If the city upstream dams the river, your city downstream starves.
Exactly. Well, let's look at the specific historical evidence rather than just assuming it. The first border conflict recorded in any detail is between the city-states of Lagash and Umma, around 2450 BCE.
It is immortalized on a stone monument known as the Stele of the Vultures.
The carvings depict the king of Lagash leading a highly organized infantry. The soldiers are carrying spears and large rectangular shields arranged in a tight, overlapping phalanx formation.
This implies they had highly trained, drilled professional armies, not just farmers handed a stick.
They also utilized early shock cavalry in the form of heavy chariots carts with solid, three-piece wooden wheels pulled by four wild asses called onagers, with the crew hurling lances.
Mud brick walls, phalanx formations, heavy chariots, and relentless centralized warfare. Mesopotamia was a brilliant, chaotic, walled-in engine of human invention and violent conflict.
But does a complex urban state have to be born in constant warfare?
If we drift further east from the volatile rivers of Sumer, we arrive at a civilization built on a completely different ethos.
One characterized by astonishing peace, vastness, and an almost mesmerizing level of extreme, pristine order.
We are entering the Indus River Valley, spanning modern-day Pakistan and northwest India.
The Indus Valley civilization, also widely known as the Harappan civilization, flourished during its mature phase from roughly 2600 to 1900 BCE.
What immediately sets the Indus Valley apart is the sheer, unfathomable geographic scale of it.
While the Mesopotamian cultural sphere covered about 65,000 square kilometers, the Indus civilization covered roughly 1.2 million square kilometers.
It boasted over 1,000 cities and settlements, supporting a massive population estimated at over 5 million people.
5 million people in the Bronze Age. That is mind-boggling.
And the cities they built, places like Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Dholavira, and Lafal, are absolute masterpieces of urban planning.
If you look at an aerial map of an excavated Sumerian town, the streets are organic, winding, and chaotic, like a maze.
But if you look at Mohenjo-Daro, it looks like a modern grid. Perfect right-angled streets running strictly north-south and east-west, dividing the city into precise residential blocks.
The meticulousness of their planning is astounding, especially their building materials. They constructed their houses using standardized fire-baked bricks.
And I mean rigorously standardized. The bricks found in cities hundreds of miles apart share the exact same dimensional proportions, typically a ratio of 4.2:1.
They were uniform in size, moisture-resistant, and incredibly durable.
Which is incredibly important for what they built next, which I argue is their greatest technological achievement: plumbing.
They prioritized public health in a way that the world wouldn't see again until the Roman aqueducts.
The houses had inner courtyards for privacy, dedicated bathing rooms, and they had sophisticated covered drainage and sewage systems running right under the streets, complete with manholes for maintenance.
Wastewater from the houses was systematically routed away into soak pits or main street drains.
And we have to analyze why they invested so heavily in this infrastructure. Plumbing isn't just a luxury at that demographic scale, it is survival tech.
When you have 5 million people living in dense urban grids, the sheer volume of human waste is catastrophic.
Without covered drainage, waterborne diseases like cholera and dysentery would trigger massive plagues, wiping out the population.
By moving wastewater away from the clean drinking wells, they allowed their population to boon in a confined space.
Their monumental architecture reflects this massive focus on public utility rather than divine kingship.
When we excavate Mohenjo-Daro, we don't find a giant ziggurat dedicated to a ruthless king built with the blood of slaves.
We find the Great Bath, a massive, watertight public bathing area sealed with natural tar, likely used for social or religious purification rituals.
The archaeological record here provides a jarring contrast to both Egypt and Mesopotamia, There are no definitive grand palaces.
There are no massive monumental temples glorifying a specific deity or ruler.
And through mortuary analysis, the scientific study of their graves and burial goods, archaeologists have found remarkably few elite burials.
In Egypt, kings were buried with mountains of gold and sacrificed servants. In the Indus Valley, wealth seems to have been distributed far more evenly.
But I have to challenge that narrative. Is it genuinely possible that a society of 5 million people, spanning over 1 million square miles, had no rulers, no kings, and no social inequality?
Human nature doesn't usually work like that.
Is it more likely that they just lacked a ruling class? Or is it that their elites showed off their power differently?
Maybe they flex their status through controlling trade monopolies and living in massive, multi-story courtyard houses, rather than burying themselves in gold under giant pyramids.
That is a highly contested point in South Asian archaeology, and your skepticism is warranted. Some experts suggest it was indeed a remarkably egalitarian society, an anomaly in the Bronze Age, where bountiful monsoon rainfall forged a condition of plenty for all, removing the desperate competition for resources that drove Mesopotamian warfare.
They suggest competitive energies were channeled entirely into commerce rather than conflict.
However, other archaeologists argue that the uniformity of the bricks, the standardized weights and measures found across 1 million square miles, and the sheer coordination of the grid cities demand a strong, centralized authority.
You don't get millions of people to build perfect sewage grids voluntarily.
The elites may have been a council of wealthy merchants or ritual priests, whose power was ideological rather than military, reflecting an invisible hierarchy.
And their commerce was undeniably vast. They were master artisans. They practiced advanced metallurgy with copper, bronze, lead, and tin.
They created intricate, highly polished jewelry from carnelian stone. We find their distinctive carved seals, small squares used to stamp wet clay on trade goods thousands of miles away in Mesopotamian cities.
These seals depict beautifully carved animals like water buffaloes, tigers, elephants, and even mythological creatures like single-horned unicorns.
The art that has survived, while smaller in scale than Egyptian statues, is incredibly evocative. There is the famous bronze dancing girl statue from Mohenjo-Daro, just 11 centimeters high, but she is striking a confident, relaxed, almost arrogant pose adorned in bangles.
And there is the steatite priest-king bust, a small soapstone carving displaying a man with a neatly trimmed beard, a headband, and a cloak patterned with trefoils.
But despite all these beautifully organized cities, these expansive trade networks, and these lively artifacts, their internal political life remains completely opaque to us because of one agonizing fact: we cannot read their writing.
It is deeply frustrating. They had a script. We find it on thousands of clay and stone tablets, pottery, and those trade seals.
It is typically written from right to left, featuring a combination of trident-shaped, plant-like, and geometric markings, but it remains entirely undeciphered.
Without a bilingual text, like the Rosetta Stone provided for Egyptian hieroglyphs, their legal codes, their mythological narratives, their poetry, and the names of their leaders are totally lost to us.
It's a silent empire, a vast, peaceful, brilliantly gridded society that left no lists of conquered enemies, no boasts of warrior kings.
Just perfect bricks, clean water, and silent, beautiful seals.
But despite their massive trade networks and their hygienic cities, the Harapans were utterly defenseless against an enemy they couldn't negotiate with, couldn't trade with, and couldn't build a wall against the shifting climate.
Around 1900 to 1800 BCE, the incredibly stable clockwork system of the Indus Valley began to fracture.
The evidence points heavily towards severe environmental and climatological shifts. The region sits near active tectonic plates, and seismic events may have diverted or disrupted the vital river systems.
But more devastatingly, the monsoons began to fail them.
The Ghaggar-Hakra River system, often identified with the mythological Saraswati River mentioned in later texts, was largely rain-fed and depended heavily on the summer monsoons.
And the monsoons started to move. The global climate pattern shifted. The heavy rains that had reliably watered their crops and filled their rivers for over a millennium began to shift eastward toward the Ganges Basin and south into the peninsula.
The climate over the Indus Valley grew significantly cooler and far more arid.
The mechanism of their agriculture collapsed. The rivers lost their immense force, retracting toward the foothills of the Himalayas.
The annual floods that brought the necessary silt and moisture became erratic, weaker, and less expensive. Inundation agriculture, the very foundation of their massive storable grain surplus, became biologically impossible to sustain at the levels needed to feed 5 million people.
So what happens to a highly complex, urbanized civilization when the water simply stops flowing? They didn't collapse in a fiery apocalyptic war.
They weren't suddenly wiped out by mysterious invaders, like the cities of the late Bronze Age collapsed in the Mediterranean. They just faded.
It was a gradual, agonizing process of deurbanization. Over a century or two, the people slowly abandoned the great grid cities.
Without surplus grain, they couldn't feed the specialized artisans or maintain the massive sewage infrastructure. The standardized weights and measures fell out of use because long-distance trade dried up.
The undeciphered script vanished because complex administration was no longer needed.
The population scattered eastward toward the Ganges Basin, resetting into smaller, isolated, self-sustaining farming villages.
These smaller communities couldn't produce the massive agricultural surpluses required to support an urban elite, and so the brilliant urban era of the Indus Valley quietly drew to a close.
I think about that a lot. Given that they faded away gently into smaller villages, rather than collapsing in a bloody, burning war, should we view the end of the Indus Valley as a failure of a civilization?
Or is it actually a massive success story, a peaceful, pragmatic adaptation to a changing planet? They realized the big cities weren't working anymore, the rivers were gone, so they packed up, abandoned the vanity of the metropolis, and downsized in order to survive.
That is a profound and very modern way to look at it. Survival is the ultimate metric of success for any biological or social system.
By dispersing, the Harappan culture didn't vanish into the void. Elements of their society, their agrarian techniques, their pottery styles, and perhaps their religious iconography seamlessly blended into the later Vedic cultures of the Indian subcontinent.
It was adaptation over annihilation. And if we pan out from the Indus Valley and look across the globe, we see this exact precarious reliance on ecological balance dictating the fate of every early complex society.
Right, because Mesopotamia and the Indus Valley weren't the only ones figuring this out. We have the divine monarchy of ancient Egypt, completely and utterly reliant on the predictable, rhythmic, gentle flooding of the Nile.
Over in East Asia, you have the Yellow River Valley giving rise to the Shang dynasty in ancient China, dealing with a river so volatile and prone to massive course changes, it was known historically as the River of Sorrow.
And completely independently across the vast oceans in the Americas, complexity was emerging without any contact with Eurasia.
In Mesoamerica, the Olmec civilization was carving colossal stone heads in the humid tropical environment of the Gulf Coast.
Down on the hyper-arid Andean coast of South America, the Carol Supi civilization was building massive urban centers and sunken circular plazas concurrently with the Egyptian pyramids.
Interestingly, Carol Supi may have relied initially on rich marine resources fishing rather than grain agriculture to fund their early monuments.
It's like humanity was a single type of seed planted in 6 different pots around the world. The Fertile Crescent, the Nile, the Indus, the Yellow River, Mesoamerica, and the Andes.
They all grew into remarkably similar, complex plants. They all developed monumental architecture, social classes, complex religion, and art.
But the specific soil, the rainfall, and the temperature in each pot dictated their unique shapes. Sumer became aggressive, walled, and highly militarized because of unpredictable, chaotic floods and tight borders. Egypt became a stable, wealthy, divine monarchy because of the incredibly reliable Nile. The Indus became a peaceful, mercantile, gridded society because of bountiful, wide-ranging monsoons.
The overarching lesson of this deep dive is that civilization is not a conquest of nature, as we so often like to believe. It is a fragile, constant negotiation with it.
Every single one of these 6 cradles of civilization was fundamentally, precariously dependent on environmental stability.
When the rivers change course, when the monsoons weaken, when the climate dries, the machinery of civilization seizes up. The society must either violently adapt, peacefully disperse, or fade back into the earth.
As we gently bring ourselves back to the present moment, I want you to think about the vast, slow passage of time we just traversed.
We started over 11,000 years ago with the nomadic hunters standing in awe, breathing heavily under the sun, hauling stone among the towering animal-carved pillars of Göbekli Tepe.
We watched the very first mud bricks dry in the biting frost of the Younger Dryas at Jericho, while a shadow crept across a 28-foot stone tower, convincing people to stay and work the soil.
We heard the clash of bronze shields and the roar of onager-drawn chariots in the chaotic, brilliant, walled cities of Sumer.
And we walked the quiet, perfectly gridded, brick-paved streets of Mohenjo-Daro, listening to the water flow beneath the streets.
It is a long, continuous, unbroken thread of human ingenuity and survival.
It is, and I want you listening to this wherever you are to realize you are holding the very end of that thread right now.
The bed you are resting in, the 60 seconds in the minute you use to tell time, the concept of writing down your thoughts, the plumbing hidden under your floorboards, and the very idea of the dense, specialized city outside your window. All of it was born in the mud, the fear, and the immense ambition of these ancient river valleys.
But as we close, there is one final, lingering detail from the very beginning of our journey that warrants quiet reflection.
When we discussed Göbekli Tepe, we noted that the monumental stone enclosures were not destroyed by enemies. They weren't toppled by earthquakes, and they weren't simply abandoned to erode in the wind.
After centuries of intense sacred use, the ancient builders themselves intentionally and carefully buried their massive stone circles.
They hauled thousands of tons of earth, limestone rubble, and refuse up the mountain to meticulously fill in the enclosures. They purposefully sealed it.
They respectfully, intentionally retired their most sacred site. They put it to sleep. It's an incredible, haunting thought to end on.
If our modern civilization, with all its concrete and steel, were to end tomorrow, would we leave behind anything so intentionally and reverently sealed for the future?
Or would we just leave behind the chaotic, uncurated plastic debris of our daily lives? What would archaeologists 11,000 years from now dig up and assume was our most sacred, venerated monument? Something to ponder as you drift off. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.